Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. So this is week 7, and we're covering chapter 6 this week. And it's an important chapter because it's all about World War II. So this chapter has a lot in it. It covers everything from the outbreak of World War II to the end of World War II. So it really covers this period of time between like the 1920s and the later 1940s. And there's a lot going on. So the bottom line is with World War II, I think one way to look at it and kind of make sense of all of it is that there was an opportunity for change throughout the world as far as governments are concerned. And the reason for that is the Great Depression. So when the Depression is going on in the 20s and in the 30s, it doesn't just affect the United States, but it also affects the entire world. So Europe for sure, and Germany was already in bad shape as a result of the Versailles Treaty after World War I. If you remember that chapter, Germany was really punished for World War I and had to pay a lot of reparations or money back to the Allied powers. So the German economy was, in shambles, and that was also true in Italy and in Poland and in Eastern Europe. Everyone was suffering economically, and as we've learned in the past, when the people don't have jobs, when the economy's poor, when there's no money, countries are vulnerable to being taken over by authoritarian regimes, and that's exactly what happens in the wind-up to World War II. So you'll read about Hitler and Germany, and you'll read about Mussolini and Italy, and those are really the two authoritarian regimes that rise up out of the ashes of the 1920s and become really aggressive with this notion of fascism, which, if we haven't discussed it before, fascism is really sort of a situation where nationalism and dictatorship sort of come in and take over. So it's not, fascism isn't communist, but it isn't democratic either. It's generally a situation where there's one authoritarian leader, and the vulnerabilities that they play upon, or what they talk about as politicians, is how great their country is and how great their people are. And this is a real powerful narrative to unite people who are struggling financially. And that's exactly what Hitler does and Mussolini does. They talk about restoring the glory to the German people or restoring the glory to the Italian people. And in a situation where the people are vulnerable, that political message has a lot of power. And so that's how these people come to power. So as you read through the chapter, and many of you know the story, Hitler gets aggressive, and initially no one in Europe does anything about it. So Hitler really starts by, moving into Austria and then eventually moving into Poland with a new, very modernized military that was something like no one ever faced before. So the military technology, Hitler had things like Tiger tanks that were very fast, different than any battlefield technologies that have been out there before, and really takes the rest of the world by storm. So, he takes over Poland, and he takes over France, and then finally pushes the Allies, so that's France and Great Britain for the most part, pushes the Allies into war. And so when this happens, the United States is sort of hanging back because it doesn't want to get into another war. But eventually that changes, and it changes after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which was Japan declaring war on the U.S. But as soon as that happened, the U.S. understands that it has to get into World War II on the Allied side in Western Europe, and also against Japan in the Pacific. So the U.S. has gone from really not being prepared for a massive battle to a major two-front war where we're fighting Japan in the Pacific and Germany in Europe. So it's a lot, and it takes the U.S. a while to sort of gear up, the war production thing. And in this period of time in the early 40s, that's exactly what happens. After the U.S. gets into war, President Roosevelt, that's Franklin Roosevelt, really takes over as far as industrial production goes. The War Emergency Powers Act, and the U.S. starts, cranking out airplanes and jeeps and tanks and training a military force that grows exponentially and eventually goes into Europe and goes into Europe through the naval invasion of D-Day, which you've heard of, and really starts to weaken the Germans as the U.S. allies with the French and with the British. So that's sort of the overview. Now, while all this is happening, the Soviet Union is also really pursuing Germany after Germany's failed attempts to take over Stalingrad. And the Red Army, which is the Russian army, is a gigantic fighting force. They lose a lot of men, and they're attacking Germany actually from the northeast. So, Hitler gets into trouble as the U.S. enters the war and the Allies regroup, and Russian is attacking the Germans from the east. Hitler is losing a lot of men and really losing a lot of power. So Hitler's decline, really starts in 1942, 1943, as the U.S. enters the war. And like anything else in war, when the theater of operations is too big, the center can't hold. And that's what was happening with Germany. They just had Russian troops getting them from the east, Allied troops from the west and south, and the rest of the story is pretty clear. Eventually, Hitler's defeated and takes his own life in a bunker in Berlin. So he dies by suicide, and the war begins to wind down. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on in this chapter, like the Holocaust, of course. So make sure you read about that, and Hitler's whole vision of this pure German race taking over the world is what he's trying to realize. So, the death camps are created in Poland in the 40s. 6 million Jews are gassed, and it's a situation like the world has never seen before. And I think when we look at wars as historians, the World War II is one of the only clearly justifiable wars as far as the U.S. is concerned, mainly because of the threat of Germany, but also because of the Holocaust. So on any grounds, whether it's human, I guess morality or aggression from an imperialist capitalist standpoint, it seems that World War II was certainly justified because of the horrific acts of the Germans and quite frankly, of the Japanese in Southeast Asia. So that's sort of the big overview. The war in the Pacific ends with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and it's obviously the end of the war. And what happens is, after the U.S. bombs Japan, the Soviet Union is in a bad position because they fear that the U.S. is going to have major influence over Asia and Southeast Asia, and that's exactly what happens. So this period of time in 1945 through 1947, as World War II ends, really this Cold War starts between the U.S. and the communists in Russia, as those two countries tend to divide up the spoils of war. In other words, Russia takes over East Germany, the Allies take over West Germany. And really this idea of the spread of communism is sort of the next adventure that we're going to get into as we move forward to our chapters that cover the post-war era. So that's it for this week. There's no assignment this week, which is pretty cool, but we may cover some of this chapter next week on our assignment. So make sure you read through it. It's interesting, it's short, and it moves fast, and it's a story everyone should know. As a matter of fact, my father was a tank driver in World War II, and actually waited for the Red Army to come into Berlin by orders of the Allies. So I have a little connection still, and it's interesting. It's an interesting war, and it really sort of changed the world order, and we're still seeing the effects of it today. So that's it for this week. Have a great week. Be safe, and I'll see you again next week. Take care now. Bye.